Automation Generation. It's nice to see JV returning to discuss a few new topics with me today. So I'm Rich, Head of Technical Consulting at Spectrum. I'll let JV introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Jon Vernoum, aka JV, digital automation consultant, and work closely with Rich on all the opportunities that I unearth.
Thanks, JV. So I think we're here to talk about master data today.
You think?
I think so.
Well, master data is like quite a precise thing, so let's get to it. So why we mentioned in the last pod that obviously master data is pretty important. I suppose a couple of questions: why is it important, and what is master data?
Okay, so let's talk about what it is to start off with. So there's a few sets of data that we use during invoice processing to automate some of the kind of capture of key fields and information from the document. So the first set of master data to talk about is business unit master data. So business units are particularly useful when companies have group structure. So if you've got multiple subsidiaries that are either based at the same location with shared finance functions or are multiple different locations, then you use business unit master data to identify who is being sent the invoice. So not the supplier, who is being sent it.
So on that then, so are we saying that potentially if you've got business unit master data, you mentioned that like a shared service sort of center, if you will, if it's like a group function, are we saying that potentially if there's a group of companies that as long as there's business unit master data, then potentially the solution could meet the requirements of all the different group companies? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's absolutely part of it. Yeah, that's absolutely part of it. So there's usually what I typically see has happened in these sort of scenarios is there's usually a couple of things either happened. One is that a company might have grown usually fairly rapidly through acquisition. So they might be kind of looking to corner the market and gone out and identified organisations that do similar things in their sector, and they're going out and buying companies within that sector to grow. And that usually means that you've got different companies with different brands being incorporated into the same kind of group structure, and typically the main group will either want to keep those brands because they're quite strong in their sectors and quite strong with their customers, or they'll want to kind of incorporate them into their own group and own branding over time, as it were. Yeah. So if you're maintaining different brands within that group structure, you'll still probably want a shared finance function at a head office location, but the purchase invoices when they come in are likely to be fairly uniquely addressed. You might still have bricks and mortar locations for each of the branches or each of the brands, and you'll certainly have them kind of named differently and those sorts of things. So that's one thing is companies growing through acquisitions, they're getting invoices in, they're for different parts of the organisation, and ultimately you probably want to post those invoices to a different company within the finance package. You might have different people that are getting involved with handling some of the queries. You might have specific parts of the AP team that focus on that particular business unit or that particular brand as well. So there's that, or the other thing that we see fairly often is that rather than them keeping the brands separately, they've kind of incorporated them into the group structure a bit more closely. And then that might mean that actually there's very little variation on the page in terms of the name that the invoice is being sent to. Yeah. And maybe the physical bricks and mortar locations are all the same because there's been a lot of consolidation. And so identifying that business unit might be a little bit trickier and might actually use a different data set.
Right, okay. And what other data sets would need to be sort of up to speed, if you like, probably not the right term, but clean and usable within a master data set then?
So the business unit data set's the first one, and that's usually the simplest one. So it's usually name, street level addressing, city, postcode, those sorts of things that you can look on the invoice and say, who is this addressed to? And therefore I can track back to who the business unit is in terms of like a business unit ID, if you like, from that level, street level addressing and those postcodes and everything, just by looking on the document and saying, what text is on the document and how much can I match back to one of those master data records to be able to identify this is who it's being sent to.
Yeah.
So in that case, obviously, the data needs to be fairly well structured. So you need to know what the street address is, what the postcode is, what the name is. But having said that, you probably want to be looking for systems that can deal with slight variations as well. So, normalizing things like LTD and limited and those sorts of differences that you might find. But master data is usually quite a compact, or business unit master data is usually quite compact, and usually doesn't take much effort to maintain. The next biggest one set of master data is the supplier master data. So typically we're looking into the finance package, bringing back a list of suppliers that are set up within that package, and gaining some of the same information as you would do with a business unit.
Yeah.
So absolutely the name, street level addressing and all those fields that I've talked about, but also doing things like, if they're VAT registered and the VAT numbers held against that record, that's can be a useful, unique piece of information.
Why is that? Because often I never see that on a document. It doesn't jump out at me that it's there. Sometimes it is, but why is that important?
Well, it can be important just to identify the supplier as much as anything.
Right.
So if that supplier, a lot of suppliers will have kind of a fairly flat structure, and they'll have, there'll be a particular entity with a particular VAT number, and it'll be unique to them. And so that same idea of looking on the page, seeing what VAT numbers you can find, and then matching that back to a VAT number in the supplier master data will allow you to say, this is the person that's sending me that invoice. And again, it's tracking back to that supplier account code, really, so that when you're posting the invoice later on, you know which supplier to post that invoice to within the purchase ledger. Okay. So really good, unique identifier. There's some exceptions to that, because you can have organisations that have gone through the same sort of process that I was speaking about in terms of group structure, and they might have one VAT number across multiple locations or branches, but often it's a good, unique identifier.
So I've got 3,000 suppliers and I've got 500 VAT reg numbers. What other things in the master data could a system or something do to go, okay, I can now identify this,
the correct supplier?
Yeah, the correct supplier.
Yeah, so you could obviously use that street level addressing, but you could also use bank account details as well.
Okay.
But that's certainly something that we return from the master data. Can be used to identify the supplier, but can also be used to ensure that you're not being sent a spurious invoice as well. You want to check some of these things. This master data is about, yes, identifying an entity, so identifying a supplier, identifying a business unit, but also making sure that we're not being conned and we're not going to pay the wrong bank account. So is the bank account on the invoice the same bank account that we use to pay? Has it changed? And if it's changed, I need to do my due diligence on that.
All right, that's quite cool then. So not only is it able to help with the sort of recognition of a supplier, and then thus being able to automate the process of it, but actually we're adding a little bit of security in there, sort of by a sort of a second prize, if you like, that actually we can ensure that we're not paying someone who's trying to dupe. Because one of the things I sort of recall is that sometimes duplicate invoices can be paid, and then it's like no one's going to go, oh, you paid me twice and here's the £10,000 that second invoice was for type scenario.
Yeah, and that's another master data set that we would regularly use is, which invoices do we already have in the system, whether they've made it onto the ledger yet or whether they're actually, sat there and have been paid or waiting to be paid. We'll check and see whether we've had this invoice from this supplier previously. And there's some kind of configuration you can do with that. So do you want to check invoice number and supplier, or do you want to check invoice number, supplier, and invoice date? You've got to be a little bit careful because sometimes credit notes will have the same credit note number as the invoice had an invoice number. So there's some questions around that. But yeah, certainly checking duplicates is another good master data set, because we've got a list of existing invoices and we're checking it.
Right. What other areas within the master data? Because I'm guessing really what we're saying here is this is where prospective clients or just businesses in general, it's in their best interest to it's a housekeeping thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. So, naturally data goes stale, doesn't it? So when you first come to enter a new supplier into the finance package, which fields do you require your users to enter? and are they entered correctly and are they entered consistently? And over time, obviously, does it go stale? Has a supplier changed location and you haven't updated it? Those sorts of things. So for me, it's you can kind of approach it one of two ways. One is that you could use some tools within our tool set to actually go through your existing data and categorize it and spot where there's missing bits of information, like VAT numbers and those sorts of things. There are tools that enable you to check and make sure addresses are correct and those sorts of things at the time that you're checking it as well. So you can do some data cleansing before you go live, which is always a good idea because it will help you get the best results from day one.
I recall you always mentioning that, if in the run up to when the project's going to be, implemented, you want to start looking at your data, then, ultimately you're going to get much better results from the get go rather than over a period of time. You might as well use that dead time to clean your master data up, mightn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, there's some quite nice tool sets now that will help you do that. So it's not necessarily a question of somebody sitting
in a dark room.
Yeah, absolutely, and going through every single record. We do have tools that we can we can use to help our clients identify those records that might need some some cleaning up before the project kind of kicks off, as it were. There's that way of doing it. Definitely, that's the preferred way. And then the other thing is that just, over time, even if you do that, over time, it will obviously encourage you to keep your data up to date, because you'll notice that if somebody does change location and you haven't changed your data, that supplier will then pop up more frequently in your exceptions, and it'll be obvious that something needs to change.
And but I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because, data is like one of the sort of new currencies, if you will. If you've got clean data and it's maintained, and I do think a lot of businesses sort of ignore that fact, if you like. It's like, well, I've got, I'll put my hands up, me and my CRM, sometimes there's things in that data set that probably need updating, contacts as an example.
Yeah.
But when it comes to that, I guess the great thing is when you have a system that can then highlight, we're getting exceptions on ABC Limited from East Yorkshire. You're going to be like, well, why are we? And then you can rectify it as you go along. But it does surprise me how data and the cleansing of data on a regular basis isn't sort of more regularly done, if you like.
Absolutely, yeah. I suppose if it's not causing you any visible problems at the time, then it's easy to ignore it, isn't it? But that doesn't say that you should do it that way, or that you should ignore it, because it has got a value, inherent value, as you say. I think the other things to consider as well, so we kind of talked about business unit master data, supplier master data, we talked about invoices themselves to check the duplicates, and we've kind of done that with a frame on how does that affect capture rates as more than anything else. How accurately does it find a supplier, for instance? But one of the things that I picked up on that you mentioned earlier on was also downstream in the kind of workflow. So after the invoice has been captured, master data will have a job to play downstream as well. So it might be that when we're talking in the last podcast about invoices without order numbers and assigning them to a specific person for approval, master data plays a role there to say, who is this supplier's approver, for instance? What's the default nominal code? Do we have payment terms that actually mean that if this invoice is stuck in exceptions for a large period of time, we might need to flag that as priority? All those sorts of things also start.
Approval levels, is that one of them that might be in there to be considered?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got invoices that need approval because they haven't got POs, or because they might go into exception because of pricing differences, then you might want to set kind of a levels that each individual person or group of people or role could approve to, and then do dual approvals and those sorts of things if it's breached. And
I suppose on the subject of master data and things like that, in your travels and the number of meetings that you have weekly, monthly, annually, what's the general consensus? Do you think most people's data is in a reasonable state, or do you think it's certainly something that actually, if a business just spent a bit of time, cleansing as they went along, they reap some more benefits?
I think you see specific types of organisation keep up to data in different ways. And,
Right.
I think that's just a natural process of what it is that they do, what kind of services and products they provide to their end users. So we were talking in the last podcast a little bit about this idea of having somebody that stocks a large amount of items and kind of just resells high volume of low value items, as it were.
Yeah.
Quite often, and this is not to put all the people in that industry down, but quite often it's difficult to keep on top of pricing because there's so many fast-moving lines and everything else, and those prices might change quite regularly, and your ERP system might affect this as well, because how easy is it for you to import a new price list? So there's lots of things to think about around that versus other organizations that might actually be saying, phone us and we'll try and source whatever it is that you need. And they've got to be a bit more careful then about going out, sourcing quotes and all those sorts of things. So their price book's going to be more up to date. So it's a wide range of experiences that I have, and certainly around that kind of that product master data and that order master data can be some people are really good at keeping it really clean, some other people aren't.
Tell me about order data, because that has proper slipped my mind.
So the order data for me is probably it's important for automating that three-way match. So for getting your highest level of automations, once you've identified your business unit, once you've identified your supplier, you might then want to be looking for one or more open orders off the invoice. Yeah, and to do that, you're going to look into the order management system, not necessarily in the financials, and say, for this supplier, what orders have I got, that are still open and outstanding.
Okay, yeah, I'm with you now.
And we typically find that you're either going to look for one order number, there's a one-to-one relationship, or you're going to have consolidated invoices where there's multiple orders on the page, and really then you're looking for order numbers at the line level as well as potentially the header level. And then actual order line items itself, so matching an individual invoice line back to an individual order line, and subsequently an individual receipt line. All of that deals with master data.
Yeah, and that must be... So is that where we're talking, you might have your part number versus the supplier's part number, and if the two are different, then we're talking we got another couple of bits of data that we need to somehow marry together to enable higher capture and pass rates.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's multiple pieces of information you can pull from an order and receipt to be able to try and match the invoice line back to that order and that receipt. So a lot of systems are locked into saying, I'm going to look for a product code on the invoice line, and I'm going to match that to a product code on the order. And if there isn't that match, then I'm never going to be able to associate that invoice line with an order line. Couple of challenges with that. One is that the product code's always going to be precise match. Is the supplier going to use their own product code even though it was raised under the purchaser's product code? And so you really want to be looking for solutions that can match on product code, but then can just look on that line and say, well, how unique is that line versus any other line that we've got? Is the number, the quantity of items that are on order, or the quantity of items been receipted, and the pricing, does that make the line unique, and therefore I can get a match? Even going so far as saying within a certain amount of tolerance of the price and the quantity being unique, is that a match? So there's a lot that you can do if you've got the ability to make sure that kind of three-way match process works well for people.
What if you're not strong or don't do goods receipting? How does that impact things?
Well, it can impact things in a multitude of different ways, but I think one of the things is that if you don't do any goods receipting, then you're always going to have that two-way match scenario. Yes, I'm expecting these goods or these goods and services to be delivered to me or consumed, but I don't know when they have been delivered or when they have been consumed. So you're always going to need to get somebody to approve those invoices, an order originator to go back and approve those invoices.
And I guess that becomes important where you've got like part deliveries and you're needing to keep that data up to date. So I've ordered 1,000 widgets and I've only received 150. That having that up to date enables the system to be able to and process future invoices off that PO.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you haven't got any receipt data, if you're not receipting items and you've got part delivery, you order 100 of one widget and only 50 are in stock at your supplier, and so only 50 come on the first delivery, then you don't want to be matching to the amount that's been ordered. You want to be matching to the amount that receipted. And there's some complication in there because it's not quite as black and white as that, because you've got the whole thing that we talked about last time about items still being in transit when you receive the invoice and everything else. So you need to be able to do some loop checking to see whether the receipt position changes over time. But it's using all of the different strategies that we're talking about on how you match the line back to order, back to product code, back to pricing, back to receipt quantities. If you're doing all of that, if you're using tolerances in there as well, then you're going to give it the highest chance of finding that match and deal with the lowest chance of exceptions. If you take one or more of those aspects away, you've got poor master data, or you're not receipting items, or you haven't got the ability to be able to match on pricing and receipt quantities, or you can't use tolerances in that matching process, then you're going to have less invoices that are automated and you're going to have less return on investment.
I'm not sure if this is part of the master data conversation. I think it is. So I order in, I don't know, tons, and my invoice comes in kgs as an example. How do you get around that?
Yeah, so it's a big challenge with that, and another thing that we've developed our own ways of dealing with. So, and that can be down to master data. So, one of the examples that we use is we've got a customer that buys food products in and repackages them and resells them. So they might buy in a ton of potatoes, let's say, and on the order it'll say it's a ton being ordered, but then they might get them delivered in 25 kilo bags. And so the pack size from what they've ordered to what they're being delivered in is different. So the quantities won't match in that case. 1 ton on order, however many bags, 25 kilo bags that makes up a ton, is getting delivered. And so there's an obvious difference in what's going to be invoiced versus what's going to be ordered. Now, if you've got those conversions in your ERP system, so you're saying, we order in a ton, but they deliver in 25s, then we can use that master data from the order and from the understanding of what the supplier does to do the maths to say that is a direct match. We tend to go one step further as well. So we can use that master data, but sometimes there isn't that master data available. So we've got our own kind of conversions built in, kind of default conversions built into our tool, so that we can then say, if it's still not a match, then run through these pack size conversions for us and see whether we can get a match when we do a calculation based on those commonly used pack sizes.
Okay, so ultimately, if you've got the stronger your master data, and even if you haven't got master data, in certain instances we can put workarounds in. You're speeding up how you can process your invoices, because some of the things we've covered in this pod just sounds like a human would take not forever, but it'd be very time consuming to do conversions, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it would be very time consuming to do that manually, and I think versus other solutions out there as well, we're able to have less exceptions by using those approaches of using master data in slightly different ways to get a higher level of automation, as it were.
Who would have thought master data could be that interesting?
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah, so that's the end of the Automation Generation podcast for today. I want to invite JV back to the next podcast, where we're going to discuss in more detail templated solutions versus untemplated solutions, the differences between those solutions, and how you can use some techniques to make untemplated solutions more accurate over time.
Yeah, I'd love to. I can't wait to discuss that, because actually I think there isn't enough knowledge out there as to the differences and the benefits of the differences as well.
Yeah,
look forward to that.
See you then.